Marcus Donovan had always believed that the price of a ticket, especially one that came with VIP perks, was simply a promise of comfort and convenience. Like countless other passengers, he had paid for a premium seat, expecting nothing more than the usual benefits: a reserved spot, extra legroom, and the small dignity that came with his purchase. That is, until a flight attendant unexpectedly approached him and insisted he move to accommodate someone deemed more important. What unfolded next would soon ignite headlines across the nation. Marcus was not the type of person who sought controversy. He only wanted to return home to the familiar comforts of his living room: a warm bed, the sound of his children laughing, and maybe a quick detour to grab some barbecue from that cozy little spot off Lindale before it closed. Earlier that day, he had even delivered a keynote address at the Minneapolis Tech Futures Conference. His presentation had been met with enthusiastic applause, punctuated by hearty handshakes from interested investors afterward. However, as he now navigated his carry-on through Terminal 1 at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, MSP, his mind was solely focused on a brief moment of quiet relaxation. For Marcus, the VIP boarding pass was nothing more than a small reward for his loyalty: a window seat with a touch more legroom, and the privilege of boarding early. It wasn't meant to be a symbol of superiority. He had purchased that seat just like anyone else. After 3 days of intense networking and engaging conversations at the conference, he was eager for the first uninterrupted moment of peace on his journey home. Marcus stood tall, a man with the build of a retired linebacker, though these days he spent more hours behind screens than lifting weights. His beard, edged with silver, hinted at the hard-won experience of a man who had struggled early in his career. His eyes, however, retained a steely focus, a constant reminder of the double effort required to receive half the recognition. His hometown, now a quiet suburb named Brookside, had been his safe haven, yet for many years he had hopped between cities, contracted work, and rented temporary housing in his quest for the stability that others seemed to take for granted. That morning, Marcus chose comfort over formality. He dressed casually in jeans, a well-fitted sport coat, and a pair of sneakers that he trusted implicitly. To him, power was not measured by the expensive suits one wore or by overt displays of wealth. Rather, it was found in the simple act of minding one's own business and maintaining a quiet dignity. A routine flight turned unexpected. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, an unsettling moment began to unfold. Seated in 2A, Marcus was idly scrolling through his emails when a flight attendant approached with a cordial smile that, on closer inspection, did not quite reach her eyes. She leaned in slightly and spoke in a low yet clear tone. "Mr. Donovan, we have a small request," she said, referring to a matter of seating arrangements. "One of our frequent flyers, seated toward the back, has requested a change. Would you be willing to switch seats with him?" Marcus looked up, puzzled by the request. "I'm sorry, could you clarify?" he asked. For a moment, the attendant hesitated before continuing. "He is a member of our premium loyalty program. It appears there has been a mix-up with your seating, as he is now requesting an upgrade of sorts." Glancing around the nearly half-full cabin, Marcus realized that he wasn't being asked to move to another VIP seat. The attendant was indicating a seat further back in the cabin, row 24 to be precise. Politely, Marcus offered a small smile. "I appreciate the offer, but I prefer to keep my assigned seat. I paid for it," he explained calmly. At that, the flight attendant's smile faltered ever so slightly. "Of course, sir. I'll inform the team," she replied, her tone curt. Marcus assumed that would be the end of the matter, but it was only the beginning. Approximately 5 minutes later, a senior flight attendant, clearly more experienced and carrying an air of authority, approached him. Her tone was decidedly less friendly. "Sir, we understand that you declined to switch seats, but unfortunately, we are now required to ask you to move," she said. Marcus's brow furrowed in disbelief. "Move? I booked this seat and paid for it days ago." "There was no indication of any conflict until now," he replied, his voice even as he maintained his composure. The attendant explained, It is our company policy when there is a seating conflict involving executive-level passengers. Marcus's eyes widened in quiet incredulity. Executive level? Do you mean staff? He asked. No, she clarified. He is part of our premium loyalty tier. We are simply asking for your cooperation. Maintaining his calm, Marcus reiterated, I booked and paid for this seat. There was no warning or explanation provided until now. Passengers nearby began to take notice, their murmurs growing louder as the exchange unfolded. Sir, the attendant repeated in a lowered tone, we can offer you a complimentary drink and a travel voucher valued at $75 as a token for the inconvenience. You are being asked to move because this individual is considered more important to our airline's policies. Marcus's silence was his only reply. With a heavy sigh, he leaned back in his seat and muttered softly, I'm not moving. The attendant did not argue further. She simply nodded once and walked away. Yet, within minutes, a third staff member arrived, this time armed with a small clipboard and an expression that left little room for negotiation. With no explanation or eye contact, she curtly announced, Mr. Donovan, please gather your belongings. You have been reassigned to seat 24B. No warning, no opportunity to object. Marcus's heart pounded as he looked back at the seat he had just paid for. His chest tightened, not from anger alone, but from a deep, unsettling sense of disbelief. Not once did he receive an apology. This was not a gesture of goodwill. It was simply the execution of a cold, impersonal procedure. The unraveling of a moment. Marcus stood slowly, each movement laden with the weight of injustice. Every step he took down the narrow aisle was scrutinized by fellow passengers. Some averted their eyes, while others stared openly, caught between sympathy and a sense of uncomfortable complicity. A young woman seated in 12C whispered to her companion, That isn't right, while an older gentleman offered a nod that spoke of shared, unspoken understanding. Without a word, Marcus placed his carry-on in the overhead bin above 24B and sat in the reassigned seat. He looked out the window, trying to regain a sense of calm, even as a hidden phone camera captured the entire sequence. The new seat, 24B, was wedged between a young man dressed in casual basketball shorts and an elderly woman who repeatedly inquired whether this was indeed the flight to St. Louis. Marcus remained silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon as he fought to keep his inner turmoil from surfacing. It wasn't the first time Marcus had encountered the kind of disregard and subtle dehumanization that sometimes plagued even the most routine transactions. Yet, there was something particularly disconcerting about this encounter. Its casual execution, its polished and rehearsed efficiency. The man who now occupied the seat Marcus had relinquished was perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in business casual attire with salt and pepper hair and a tan polo shirt. His demeanor exuded quiet authority, the sort that suggested he always received what he wanted, regardless of the inconvenience it imposed on others. Remarkably, he never once glanced back in Marcus's direction. In that moment, Marcus recalled a lifetime of small indignities. He had endured rude remarks, subtle biases, and dismissive treatment in situations where he was meant to belong. But this was different. This was not a private boardroom or an exclusive club where such power plays were expected. It was a commercial flight, a transaction that any working person in America could relate to. And yet, here he was made to feel insignificant in a setting that should have affirmed his right to be there. Marcus fumbled with his phone, not to broadcast his outrage on social media, but simply to distract himself from the heavy emotions rising inside. However, even as he attempted to focus on mundane notifications, he couldn't ignore the low murmur of conversation around him. I think they moved that guy, one passenger remarked quietly, a sentiment that echoed in the hushed voices nearby. He paid for that seat. Another added, disbelief tinging his tone. He chose not to engage further, not wanting to escalate the situation. He was not ready to become a symbol, a man standing up against injustice in a moment of crisis. All he wanted was to fly home and forget the ordeal. Yet, as the plane began its smooth ascent into the skies, Marcus felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The discomfort, once contained to a single aisle, seemed to have spread like ripples across the cabin. Somewhere 2 rows ahead, a teenager named Janelle Rivera, a bright-eyed 16-year-old visiting her aunt in Brookside, had been quietly editing a video on her phone. Initially, she had intended to capture small, humorous moments for her social media stories. However, when she witnessed the flight attendant's seemingly rehearsed request for Marcus to move, something in her instinct urged her to hit record. With the in-flight Wi-Fi active and her fingers tapping quickly, she uploaded the raw footage to TikTok with a simple caption, "He paid for it." No hashtags, no dramatic filters, just the unembellished truth. The video spread rapidly. Back in seat 24B, Marcus was still immersed in his thoughts. He had not yet looked at his phone, trying instead to calm himself by thinking of his daughter's science project, his son's upcoming basketball tryouts, and the promise he had made to repair a pair of sneakers for his wife, Elaine. The small, everyday details of his life anchored him amidst the whirlwind of emotions. Yet, even as he tried to let the incident fade into the background, he could still hear the clink of glasses from the front of the plane and the subtle hum of conversation from the nearby seats. Conversations that had now taken on a note of disquiet. In seat 2A, the man who had once been Marcus was now forced to watch the world react to his quiet protest. It wasn't until the plane reached its cruising altitude that he finally noticed the flurry of notifications on his phone. 3 missed calls, 2 texts from colleagues and friends he hadn't spoken to in years. One text, in particular, caught his attention. "Man, you're trending." Curious and still struggling with a mixture of disbelief and resignation, Marcus clicked the link sent by his colleague. There on his screen, he saw the video, clear audio capturing every measured word. The moment the flight attendant had uttered company policy and Marcus's quiet yet firm reply, "I paid for this seat," was immortalized for all to see. The footage was accompanied by a cascade of comments. One viewer wrote, "So he's still doing this in 2025? This man handled it better than I ever would. He deserves every dime back." And then some skybound air. Marcus stared at the screen, stunned. He felt neither anger nor hurt. He was simply taken aback by the way a personal moment of indignity had been transformed into a public spectacle. The very air of casual injustice was now the subject of nationwide debate. The viral storm and its aftermath. As the flight continued its journey through the clear skies, the viral video began to take on a life of its own. On the ground, the comments and messages started to pour in. People from every walk of life were weighing in on the injustice they had witnessed, each comment a mixture of outrage, empathy, and a call for change. Marcus tried to push the notifications aside, closing his eyes as he imagined the comforting faces of his family, the smiling image of Elaine, the laughter of his children, and the simple joy of returning to a routine he so dearly missed. Yet, even as the plane soared high above the earth, the digital storm on his phone grew louder with every passing minute. By the time the flight reached its destination, the notifications had transformed into a relentless barrage. The once quiet moments on the plane were now interwoven with the cacophony of public opinion. Headlines began to appear on news websites. Breakfast shows discussed the incident on live television, and social media threads, stacked with dozens of comments, began dissecting the details of what had transpired. On landing, Marcus felt an overwhelming mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. As the plane taxied slowly toward the gate, he sensed that something was different. The glances he received from fellow passengers were heavier, laden with sympathy and a shared sense of injustice. A few people exchanged subtle looks, while others whispered into their phones as if documenting the unfolding drama. Among these observers was the very same teenager, Janelle Rivera, who had captured the incident on her phone. For a brief moment, she glanced up, her eyes meeting Marcus's in a silent exchange of mutual understanding before she quickly resumed her seat. It was clear to Marcus that, even as he struggled to make sense of the situation, his personal experience had struck a chord with others. Marcus powered off airplane mode and braced himself as his phone buzzed incessantly. The screen lit up with a series of messages, texts from colleagues, unexpected calls from old acquaintances, emails from reporters, and even a LinkedIn message from someone at the Chicago Tribune. Amidst this digital uproar, one headline stood out, pinned at the top of his notifications. Black passenger removed from VIP seat on Skybound Air sparks outrage. He read the headline twice, then a follow-up message arrived seconds later. Passenger downgraded mid-flight due to loyalty policy. Airlines scramble for answers. Marcus's heart pounded as he processed the information. It was surreal. A moment that had been a quiet personal affront was now magnified into a national discussion about corporate policies, fairness, and the subtle abuses of loyalty programs. On the flight, the murmurs of discontent continued to grow. The man in seat 2A, who had once shared his space with Marcus, leaned over and said quietly, "People got your back. You should speak out." But Marcus merely exhaled slowly, unsure whether he was ready to transform his personal grievance into a public crusade. By the time the plane touched down, a smooth landing at Midway, just after 6:30 p.m., under a clear sky, Marcus was engulfed in a blend of exhaustion, apprehension, and a dawning awareness that this incident was far from over. Outside the plane, in the bustling terminal, the attention did not fade. Instead, it had only just begun. Within minutes of disembarking, a young man in a red hoodie, no older than 20, approached Marcus. His nervous energy was palpable. "Mr. Donovan," he stammered. "I just wanted to say, I saw the video. What they did wasn't right. Thank you for handling it so calmly." Marcus offered a small nod of acknowledgement. The young man seemed eager to continue, perhaps to share more thoughts or simply to offer further thanks. But he soon melted back into the crowd. With a heavy carry-on in one hand and his phone still buzzing in the other, Marcus made his way slowly through the terminal. Each step reminded him of the personal nature of the encounter, one that, despite its calm exterior, had now erupted into a public controversy. Before long, Marcus's phone rang again. This time, it was an email from Skybound Air's corporate office. The message was brief and impersonal. "We are aware of your experience on Flight 624. A representative will be contacting you shortly. We value your feedback." Marcus read the email twice, its sterile tone doing little to soothe the hurt and indignity he had experienced. Stepping outside the terminal to await his rideshare, Marcus found himself seated on a bench near the passenger pickup area. His gaze was drawn, almost unwillingly, to a stranger's phone screen across from him, a screen where his own face stared back. The realization was painful. A private moment of injustice had been turned into a public spectacle. As Marcus sat there, a man in basketball shorts nearby leaned over and murmured, "Yo, you see this?" A nod from Marcus confirmed the shared sentiment, a silent acknowledgement of the absurdity and cruelty of a system that allowed such treatment to be normalized. When the flight attendant's actions became public knowledge, the internet reacted with an intensity that Marcus could hardly have imagined. By the next morning, his name was splashed across news outlets, social media platforms, and television screens nationwide. The viral video had ignited a firestorm of criticism aimed at Skybound Air's loyalty policies. Headlines like "Passenger Downgraded for Premium Status Sparks National Outcry" and "VIP Seat Controversy, When Loyalty Points Become a Weapon" appeared everywhere. One headline in particular, pinned by a news app notification, read, "Black passenger removed from VIP seat on Skybound Air sparks outrage." Marcus read the headline twice, each time feeling a mix of disbelief and a reluctant awareness that this moment was larger than himself. The digital commentary was relentless, with viewers questioning, "Why do we keep pretending this is okay? And when will these policies change?" In the midst of the public uproar, Marcus began receiving messages from people whose lives had been touched by similar experiences. An anonymous text from a flight attendant, one who admitted to being ordered to reassign a passenger before, spoke volumes. "I've been told to do that before. Move someone less loyal for someone who spends more. I've hated myself for it ever since. I'm sorry this happened to you." That evening, Marcus sat alone in a quiet hotel room. The hum of the city outside was a distant backdrop to the storm raging within his thoughts. His phone, now a constant companion, buzzed with notifications. Messages from old coworkers he hadn't heard from in years, emails from reporters eager to know his side of the story, and even a LinkedIn message from someone at the Chicago Tribune inviting him for an interview. One subject line in his inbox read, "Good morning from CNN. We'd love to speak with you today, if you're open to it." He let the phone slip from his grasp, almost as if it were too heavy with the weight of expectation. Marcus's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of him felt relief at finally having been thrust into the spotlight for standing up for what was right, while another part longed to return to the anonymity of his everyday routine, a routine that now seemed irreparably altered. A journey from private injustice to public dialogue. The next day, as dawn broke, Marcus woke to an inbox filled with 142 unread messages and 5 missed calls. 2 of those calls were from unknown numbers. One turned out to be from a local Chicago station, another from a woman named Monique Glass, a senior producer at National Morning Show. Bleary-eyed and still processing the surreal turn of events, Marcus sat at his hotel's small kitchen table, watching the coffee brew slowly as he tried to ground himself in reality. Despite the heavy influx of digital communications, one thing was abundantly clear. This incident was no longer just about a misplaced seat on a flight. It had become a focal point for a much larger conversation, a conversation about corporate power, the casual dismissal of individual rights, and the everyday indignities suffered by hard-working people across America. Later that morning, while Marcus was still sitting quietly in his room, his phone buzzed again. A new headline emerged. Passenger downgraded mid-flight due to loyalty policy. Airline scramble for answers. He read it twice, the words sinking in with an almost cinematic gravity. It was as if the entire nation had paused to question how such treatment could be normalized in a society that prided itself on fairness and equality. At that moment, Marcus's phone received another call from Monique Glass. When he answered, her voice was gentle yet insistent. "Mr. Donovan, thank you for taking my call. I promise to keep this brief. We've seen the video, and we understand this isn't how you planned your week. But if you're willing to speak to us, we'd like to give you the time and space to tell your side. We're not looking to script you, just let you share what happened, as it is." Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. "What do you expect me to say? I'm just telling the truth about what happened," he replied quietly. Monique's tone softened further. "We want you to speak from your heart, Mr. Donovan. No drama, no exaggeration, just the truth. People deserve to know how normal this kind of treatment is." For the next hour, Marcus mulled over the decision. He was not someone who craved the spotlight, nor did he wish to be cast as a hero. In fact, the idea of having his personal ordeal turned into a media spectacle made him feel uncomfortable. Yet, as messages continued to pour in, messages from strangers, parents, and workers in various industries, all sharing their own experiences of being dismissed or treated unfairly, he realized that his story resonated with countless others who had been silenced by similar incidents. After much internal debate, Marcus agreed to participate in an interview, not out of a desire for attention, but because he felt that silence would only serve to embolden the systems of power that had wronged him. His decision was reinforced by one particularly poignant message he had read, a message from a flight attendant who, under the veil of anonymity, had confessed, "I've been forced to ask passengers to give up their seats before. I've done things I'm not proud of. I'm sorry this happened to you." That evening, Marcus found himself in front of a small webcam in his hotel room. He wore a plain, dark shirt with no logos, no attempt to project an image of defiance or rebellion. He simply looked directly into the camera and began to speak in a measured, calm voice. "I want to talk about what happened on Flight 624, he began. "I didn't raise my voice, I didn't call names, and I certainly didn't try to make a scene. I only stated the truth, that I paid for a seat, and that my seat was taken from me without any consideration for the fact that I had earned it through hard work." He continued, explaining how the entire episode unfolded with an unnerving calmness, detailing how the flight attendants executed their roles with such scripted precision that it felt more like a performance than enforcement of policy. His voice never wavered, and he spoke of the incident not with anger, but with a quiet determination that resonated deeply with his viewers. Within minutes, his nearly 4-minute video had garnered millions of views. Overnight, Marcus Donovan became a symbol, not of defiance, but of the everyday struggle against an indifferent system. The headlines that followed were both sympathetic and scathing. One article headlined, "Passenger Removed for Loyalty Status Sparks Industry-Wide Debate on Fairness," while another boldly proclaimed, "When a seat is taken, the quiet rebellion of a man who only wanted to fly home." The reaction was swift and unyielding. Across social media platforms, people shared their own stories of small injustices that, when accumulated, painted a picture of systemic disregard for the rights of everyday consumers. In coffee shops, at workplaces, and even in family homes, the narrative that Marcus had inadvertently started began to reshape the conversation around customer service and corporate accountability. In interviews that followed, Marcus was careful to emphasize that he was not seeking accolades. "I'm not here to get free tickets or to launch a media tour," he explained in one interview with a local Chicago news station. "I'm simply here to remind everyone that, at the end of the day, we are all human. We deserve to be treated with respect, regardless of our loyalty status or the amount of money we spend." His measured tone resonated with many. People began quoting his words, "How many people get treated like this and don't have a camera nearby?" in discussions about fairness and dignity in everyday transactions. His story, one that began with the simple act of paying for a seat on a flight, had now evolved into a broader critique of a system that allowed corporate policies to override basic human decency, repercussions, and a call for change. Within days, the fallout from Marcus's experience grew more pronounced. The corporate headquarters of Skybound Air was forced to confront the widespread criticism. Emergency meetings were convened, legal counsel was called in, and public relations teams scrambled to formulate a response that would placate a now outraged public. The airline's initial statement was tepid at best, a generic apology that failed to acknowledge the personal affronts suffered by Marcus Donovan. "We regret any experience that does not reflect our values," the statement read, offering no real explanation or accountability. It was clear that Skybound Air was more concerned with managing its public image than with addressing the systemic issues at hand. However, as more stories of similar mistreatment began to surface, stories of passengers who had been reassigned without warning, of loyal customers who had been devalued by their own airline's policies, the pressure on Skybound Air intensified. Old complaints resurfaced on social media, and internal memos detailing past incidents of seat reassignments were leaked to the press. One particularly damning post recounted an incident from 2019 where a young woman had been forced to give up her seat in favor of a man with VIP status. The pattern was unmistakable. Back in Chicago, Marcus found himself inundated with messages from strangers who had felt similarly small and disrespected in their everyday lives. A teacher from Missouri wrote, "I showed your interview to my students to illustrate how small actions can have a big impact. You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes just standing your ground is enough." Marcus tucked that message away, cherishing it as a reminder that his experience had resonated far beyond the confines of an airplane cabin. Soon, his story caught the attention of a national magazine that published a feature titled "A Seat Taken: How One Quiet Passenger Challenged an Industry." The article opened with a full-page photograph of Marcus, not in a heroic pose, but simply sitting with a calm, resolute expression, his eyes reflecting the quiet dignity of a man who had refused to be humiliated. The piece struck a chord with readers across the country, prompting widespread debate about the balance of power between corporations and their customers. In response to the mounting backlash, Skybound Air's executives convened an emergency meeting. The situation had escalated to the point where stockholders were growing anxious, and even the airline's internal critics within the company could no longer remain silent. Finally, just 4 days after the flight, Skybound Air issued a second, more direct statement. This time, The statement read, "We sincerely apologize to Mr. Marcus Donovan. Our internal investigation has confirmed that our protocol was misapplied on Flight 624, and we take full responsibility for the mistreatment he experienced. As a result, the flight crew involved has been terminated, effective immediately, and we are implementing new mandatory training procedures across all tiers of staff." The statement was not perfect, but it was a clear acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Within hours, headlines began to appear. Skybound Air fires flight crew following viral video. Airline revises loyalty policy after public backlash, and passenger downgraded for premium status sparks industry-wide change. For Marcus, the ordeal had shifted from a personal humiliation to a catalyst for industry reform. The public outcry forced not only Skybound Air, but also other airlines to re-examine their policies. Major carriers like Delta, JetBlue, and Southwest soon released statements affirming their commitment to transparent seating procedures, with some even inviting passengers to share their own experiences of mistreatment for the purpose of internal reviews. Yet for Marcus, the true measure of success was not in the headlines or the corporate apologies. It was in the stories that poured in from everyday people, stories that affirmed he was not alone in his experience. He received a message from a woman who recounted being forced to give up her seat on a cross-country flight because a preferred traveler had arrived late, and another from a man who had been downgraded without explanation on more than one occasion. These messages, filled with both sorrow and hope, coalesced into a broader narrative of resistance against an indifferent system. That same weekend, Marcus was invited to speak at a roundtable discussion hosted by the Department of Transportation. Representatives from multiple airlines were present, and the panel was designed to discuss customer equity and internal accountability. With a mix of trepidation and determination, Marcus stood before the group and recounted his experience, not with dramatic flourishes or vitriolic outbursts, but with the same quiet resolve that had characterized his journey from the airplane cabin to the public eye. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Marcus told the panel, his voice steady. "I'm asking you to listen, really listen, to the concerns of everyday people. When we are treated as expendable, when our dignity is brushed aside for the sake of policy or profit, we all lose a little of our humanity. I'm here today not to demand free tickets or reparations, but to insist on fairness for every customer." The words resonated in the room. After the panel, a young staffer from another airline approached him softly, saying, "I've been in this industry for 3 years, and I've seen things that should never happen. Thank you for speaking out. It gives me hope that things might change." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips, a silent acknowledgement that even in the smallest gestures, there was power, building the framework for change. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's experience evolved into something far greater than a singular incident. He began receiving invitations from organizations and advocacy groups eager to have him participate in discussions on customer rights and corporate accountability. One such invitation came from Carlton Drew, a senior director at Horizon Mobility Group, the parent company of 3 major U.S. airlines, including Skybound Air. The email from Carlton was simple: "We'd like to speak with you off the record." Marcus was initially hesitant. He didn't want to be co-opted as a spokesperson or a brand ambassador. Yet, curiosity and a sense of responsibility eventually led him to make a phone call. Carlton's voice, measured and direct, explained that while many within the airline industry had been aware of the issues, they lacked the perspective of someone who had experienced it firsthand. "I appreciate your calling, Mr. Donovan," Carlton said. "We've seen what you had to say, and many of us are listening. We'd like to invite you to consult with our leadership board on customer equity and internal accountability. Of course, you would be compensated for your time. We need your perspective, an honest look at what needs to change." Marcus listened carefully. He wasn't sure what to expect. His mind, still reeling from the previous day's events, recognized that this might be an opportunity not just to tell his story, but to influence real change within an industry that had long taken its loyal customers for granted. Over the next few days, Marcus deliberated on Carlton's offer. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his modest home, Sipping tea while the streetlights flickered on, Elaine joined him on the patio bench. Her eyes, filled with quiet concern, met his as she asked, "Are you okay?" Marcus offered a small, reassuring smile. "I'm trying to make sense of all this," he replied. "I never expected that something as simple as a seat on a flight would turn into a national conversation." Elaine reached out and took his hand gently. "You didn't ask for any of it, but you handled it with such grace. That means something, Marcus." After a long silence filled with the sounds of the quiet night, Marcus finally spoke. "I've been thinking about the call from Horizon Mobility Group. I'm not looking to become a brand or a celebrity. I just want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else." Elaine squeezed his hand in agreement. "Maybe you can help shape something better," she suggested softly. The next day, Marcus emailed Carlton back with one condition: that every session begin with a recorded, anonymous testimony from real passengers and crew. Stories both good and bad, unedited and unfiltered. Carlton agreed without hesitation. 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself in a boardroom in Dallas. The room was filled with about a dozen people in crisp suits, a whiteboard covered in statistics, and a palpable tension in the air. One of the board members, a thoughtful woman with glasses, asked, "Do you think the public overreacted?" Marcus's response was quiet but firm. "No, I think people were just waiting for an example, a reminder that they deserve to be treated with respect. This isn't about me. It's about all of us who have ever felt that our worth was measured only by our loyalty points or our spending power." Over the next month, Marcus worked closely with the board to draft what came to be known as the Seat Fairness Framework. This plain-language policy puts strict limits on involuntary seat changes, regardless of a passenger's loyalty status. The framework was eventually adopted by not one, but 3 major airlines and even cited in an FAA policy review. It wasn't money or fame that drove Marcus. He remained the same humble man who still wore his old watch and drove his modest hybrid sedan, complete with a persistently squeaky air conditioning vent. Yet, every so often, he would receive a letter, one from a high school teacher in Missouri who wrote, "I share your interview with my students when we discuss how small actions can create big changes. I tell them, you don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, standing your ground is enough." Marcus kept that letter carefully taped behind a framed photo on his office desk. As the months rolled on, Marcus's journey took on an almost cinematic quality. He began to receive invitations to speak at various events and even appeared on a couple of national broadcasts. One morning, while sitting across from a Chicago-based host during an in-depth interview, the host leaned in and asked, "Mr. Donovan, many are calling you a symbol of resistance. How do you feel about that?" Marcus almost smiled, a gentle, wry expression playing on his lips. "I feel like I got kicked out of a seat I paid for," he said softly. "That doesn't make me a hero. It makes me human." I believe this story caught fire because it was a reminder that everyone, no matter how small the transgression, deserves to be seen and heard. His voice was neither loud nor angry. It was the measured tone of someone who had weathered countless storms and still believed in the simple power of fairness. Over time, his interview was replayed in waiting rooms, on car radios during lunch breaks, and in countless social media feeds. People, inspired by his quiet dignity, began to use his words as a rallying cry. How many people get treated like this and don't have a camera nearby? A lasting impact. In the weeks following the interview, the momentum continued to build. Skybound Air's internal investigations unearthed a long-standing, unspoken guideline, one that had quietly permitted loyalty overrides, allowing premium passengers to displace those who had paid full price for their seats. A whistleblower even sent an anonymous letter to several major news outlets, detailing how this practice had been approved 2 years earlier with virtually no public scrutiny. Marcus read the anonymous letter late one night, the words sinking into his mind as he tried to piece together the bigger picture. Elaine sat beside him on their worn but comfortable couch, scrolling through her own social media feed. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her eyes filled with empathy. Marcus managed a tired smile. "I'm just trying to understand it all. We never really questioned why this was allowed. I guess it was just assumed that if you had enough loyalty points, you were somehow more important. Elaine squeezed his hand. But you stood your ground, and that's what matters. A national magazine soon published a feature article titled, "A Seat Taken: How One Quiet Passenger Challenged an Industry." The article, accompanied by a full-page photograph of Marcus sitting calmly, unadorned by any theatrical gestures, struck a chord with the public. Even the CEO of Skybound Air was forced to give a live press conference, a rare event indeed. Under intense questioning, he admitted, "We failed. We allowed policies to override the basic human dignity of our passengers. And for that, we are sorry." Not everyone was convinced, of course. Skeptics argued that Marcus's calm demeanor was merely a product of his personality, and that corporate policies were simply a means to manage a large volume of passengers efficiently. But the wave of personal stories that followed, stories of passengers who had been treated similarly, made it clear that what had happened on Flight 624 was not an isolated incident. For Marcus, the legacy of that fateful flight was not measured in fleeting moments of media attention, but in the lasting change that began to take root. Soon after the incident, he received a call from a local Chicago station. "Mr. Donovan," the reporter said, "we're hearing that your experience has sparked a movement. People are coming forward with their own stories. What do you have to say to them?" Marcus's reply was simple. "I'm not here to make myself a hero. I'm here to remind you that every time you stand up for your rights, you make it a little harder for injustice to hide behind corporate policy. I hope that my story inspires you to speak up, even if you're just asking for what you rightfully deserve." In time, Marcus began to see the tangible results of his quiet rebellion. New policies were implemented not only at Skybound Air, but across the airline industry. Customer service training programs were overhauled, and a greater emphasis was placed on treating every passenger with respect, regardless of their loyalty status. The Seat Fairness Framework became a model for fairness in customer relations, its plain language a beacon for transparency and accountability. Marcus's life, however, remained largely unchanged in the personal sphere. At home, his children continued to see him as the gentle, hard-working father who always made time for bedtime stories and weekend adventures. Elaine, ever supportive, never let the public attention alter the intimate, loving rhythm of their daily life. Even when news cameras occasionally showed up on the street or his face appeared on talk shows, Marcus remained grounded, always returning to the comfort of his family and his modest routine. His daughter, Mia, now 11 years old, once asked him one evening, "Dad, why did they make you move?" Marcus paused, choosing his words with care. "They thought the other passenger was more important," he explained gently. "But sometimes, when no one speaks up, people continue to believe that's okay." Mia nodded thoughtfully, her young mind absorbing the lesson in fairness that her father had so quietly demonstrated. In the aftermath of the ordeal, Marcus received numerous letters and messages from people who had found courage in his actions. One message came from a middle school teacher in Kansas who wrote, "I showed your interview to my class to demonstrate that standing up for yourself, even in small ways, can spark significant change. Thank you for inspiring us to be brave in the face of injustice." Another letter from an elderly man in Florida simply read, "I always felt invisible on flights. Today, you made me feel seen." Yet for Marcus, the most profound change was the realization that even the smallest act of resistance, a refusal to relinquish a seat, had the power to resonate on a grand scale. The incident that began as a private inconvenience had morphed into a national dialogue about dignity, fairness, and the subtle ways in which corporate policies can erode individual rights. Epilogue: the quiet strength of staying put. 2 weeks after the fateful flight, as Marcus prepared for another journey, a quiet flight to Sacramento, he found himself reflecting on all that had transpired. This time, he deliberately booked a seat in 1C, far from any potential disruptions. As he settled into his seat, a flight attendant approached with her customary warm smile. "Is there anything I can get you before takeoff, Mr. Donovan?" she asked politely. Marcus looked out the window for a brief moment, then turned back to her with quiet assurance. "No, thank you. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he replied, his tone carrying the weight of his experiences. It was a small statement, but one laden with meaning, a silent assertion that sometimes simply sitting still is the most powerful act of all. Over time, Marcus's experience became more than just a story of a single flight. It grew into a movement, a catalyst for change that reminded everyone that dignity and respect should never be compromised by corporate policies. His journey from personal indignity to a public discussion of fairness was a testament to the strength of a quiet, steadfast spirit. In the years that followed, as Marcus continued to travel and as new policies were adopted by airlines nationwide, he remained a humble observer of change. He was never one to seek the spotlight, and yet his unwavering stand had left an indelible mark on an industry that had once taken its passengers for granted. Every time he boarded a plane, he recalled the moments of that long-ago flight. Moments that had reshaped the narrative around customer service, loyalty programs, and ultimately, the respect that every individual deserves. For every passenger who ever felt small or dismissed, Marcus Donovan's story served as a quiet reminder. True power lies not in loud declarations or public outbursts, but in the courage to stand firm in one's convictions, even when that stance means simply remaining seated in the face of injustice. And so, as the sun set on another day of quiet victories and small, meaningful acts, Marcus looked out the window of yet another flight, feeling a sense of calm resolve. In that simple act of staying in his seat, he had spoken volumes, speaking to the countless individuals who had ever been made to feel less than they truly were, and inspiring a movement that would continue to ripple through the corridors of corporate power and into the lives of everyday people.